The file begins. March 25th, 2024. A date burned into the silicon of history. Helicopters like steel vultures descended not on a war zone, but on the manicured lawns of Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. Simultaneously, the sun over Miami's Star Island was blotted out by the same federal shadow. This wasn't a tax audit. This was a siege. The gates of the Combs empire, once a symbol of untouchable success, were breached by agents in tactical gear. They moved with a cold purpose through rooms that reeked of champagne and secrets. The world watched, disbelieving, as the architecture of a dynasty was dismantled on live television. This was the opening act in the anatomy of a fall, a public vivisection. The charge wasn't just a crime. Pause. It was a reckoning. The public reaction was a tidal wave of cognitive dissonance. How could the man who taught a generation to hustle, the maestro of the remix, be at the center of this darkness? The brand was Bad Boy, not this. The digital town square was flooded with confusion, then anger. Then, the whispers that had circulated for years in green rooms and on burner phones began to surface into the light. The lawsuit filed by the singer Cassie months earlier was no longer a singular event. It was Chapter 1. Suddenly, the legendary parties didn't look like celebrations. They looked like evidence. The persona of the ultimate host began to curdle into something predatory. Every photograph, every old interview was now re-examined under the harsh light of the allegations. The man who built an empire on image was about to be destroyed by it. This was the first invoice for a lifetime of excess. The full bill, pause, was yet to come. To understand the debt, you must first audit the origins of the hunger. It was born in Harlem, forged in the shadow of a ghost. His father, Pause Melvin Combs, an associate of the infamous Pause Frank Lucas, was a specter in the narrative. A hustler shot dead in his car in Central Park when Sean was just 2. That event wasn't a memory. It was a piece of code written into his DNA, a fatal inheritance of ambition and risk. He didn't run from that shadow. He tried to outrun it. His time at Howard University wasn't about education. It was an inventory of opportunity, a training ground for the Howard hustle. He commuted to an internship at Uptown Records, learning the machinery of fame from Pause Andre Harrell. He wasn't a musician. He was a conductor of desire, a man who could hear the frequency of money in a demo tape. But ambition without discipline is a fire without a hearth. In 1991, the flames leapt the walls. A celebrity basketball game he promoted at City College of New York. Overcrowded. A stampede. Pause. 9 people were dead. It was the first major invoice. A tragedy written off as a cost of doing business. A down payment on the empire to come. Getting fired from Uptown Records after the City College disaster should have been his exile. Instead, it became his genesis. He took the blueprint, the ambition, and the one asset that mattered most. A Brooklyn kid with a heavy voice and a storyteller's cadence. Christopher Wallace. Pause. The notorious B.I.G. This was not an artist. This was a cornerstone for an empire. The bad boy formula was brutally effective. It was musical alchemy. Take the warm, familiar soul of the past, slice it into loops, and lay the cold, hard ambition of the future over it. It was the sound of escaping the ghetto in a limousine. He sold a fantasy packaged in shiny suits and drenched in champagne. The competition, Death Row Records, sold brutal reality. It was a war of philosophies fought on the airwaves, gold versus lead. While Sujay Knight ruled with fear, Combs ruled with image. He put himself in the frame. The whispered ad-libs, the dance moves in the videos. He wasn't just the producer. He was the product, the brand. The roster grew. Craig Mack, Faith Evans, Mace, an assembly line of hits that turned the label into a mint. But the machine required constant fuel, constant pressure. The shine of the platinum plaques cast very long, very dark pause shadows. The first tremors were not earthquakes. They were whispers in the foundation. Minor lawsuits from producers and artists, claiming their work was strip-mined for hits. These were dismissed. The bitter noise of the unsuccessful, the cost of doing business at the top. But the noise got louder. Pause December 1999. Club New York. This was not a business dispute. This was gunfire in a crowded room, a public spectacle of power and paranoia. He walked away, acquitted, while his protege, the rapper Shine, took the fall and a decade in prison. A brutal lesson in board dynamics. The king is protected. The pawns are expendable. Money became a form of alchemy, transmuting criminal charges into public relations problems. And PR problems could be buried under mountains of cash and celebrity goodwill. Each settlement was a quiet funeral for a sliver of truth. A fatal error was being made, repeated until it became habit. The belief that every sin had a price tag, and that he could always afford it. In the private ledgers of the empire, there were expenses that never saw a balance sheet, events that existed only in rumor and sealed depositions. The anatomy of the fall begins here, in the curated darkness of the alleged freak-out parties. These were not celebrations. They were recruitment drives. They were loyalty tests. They were laboratories for the study of human weakness. The testimonies paint a clinical picture. Phones collected at the door like coats. Drinks laced with something more than alcohol. A transaction where access to the throne room required a down payment of one's dignity. Producers like Pause Rodney Lil Rod Jones described a system. A culture of coercive auditions where the line between collaboration and violation was deliberately erased. It was a factory for creating secrets. And secrets in Pause Combs' world were a more stable currency than the dollar. They were the collateral that kept the silence. The chains invisible and heavy that bound an entire ecosystem to his will. But those invisible chains had a physical counterpart. The federal government decided to conduct its own inventory of sins. March 2024. The empire's gates in Pause, Los Angeles and Miami, were breached not with a polite knock, but with the cold steel of battering rams. This wasn't an arrest, it was an excavation. Agents moved through the opulent halls like archaeologists in a pharaoh's cursed tomb. They weren't looking for gold. They were hunting for the digital ghosts on hard drives, the transactional histories on burner phones. The architecture of the homes themselves became a subject of morbid fascination, with whispers of secret tunnels. A hidden network designed not for escape from intruders, but perhaps for moving assets, human or otherwise unseen. The official manifests listed confiscated electronics, weapons, and servers. Each item a piece of the anatomy of the fall. Each hard drive a potential digital coffin, holding testimonies the living were too afraid to speak. The silence of the concrete mansions was finally broken by the sound of evidence bags being sealed. The federal raid was the aftershock. The earthquake had already happened months earlier, in November 2023. It had a name. Pause Cassie Ventura. Her lawsuit was the first stone pulled from the foundation, and the entire edifice of power began to groan. The court documents read like a Gothic novel rewritten by a corporate lawyer. Allegations of control that bordered on ownership, of a decade-long cycle of abuse, meticulously documented. But the lawsuit's most potent weapon wasn't a paragraph of legalese. It was a video. Grainy, silent footage from a hotel hallway in 2016. A ghost in the machine that became undeniable proof. It showed a brutal, physical truth that no amount of PR or money could erase. That video turned whispers into a roar. The case was settled in a single day. The speed of the resolution was its own confession. It was a desperate attempt to put the fire out, but the embers were already carried on the wind, igniting other long-suppressed stories. Cassie's lawsuit wasn't just a legal action, it was a verdict rendered in the court of public perception long before any judge was involved. The settlement was not a ceasefire. It was the sound of a war room door slamming shut. Combs' legal team, a phalanx of high-priced gladiators, launched a counter-offensive. Their strategy was an anatomy of denial. They issued statements sculpted from granite and ice, speaking of meritless claims and character assassination. They sought to bury the truth under an avalanche of paperwork. Each new lawsuit was met with a motion to dismiss, a procedural shield against a narrative already running wild. This wasn't about innocence, it was about containment. They were trying to build a legal firewall around a burning kingdom, but the flames were already inside the walls. The lawyers argued timelines and technicalities, while the world watched a man's legacy turn to ash. It was a meticulous, expensive, and ultimately futile inventory of sins. A desperate attempt to prove that the videotape was a lie. Public opinion does not turn, it shatters. For 30 years, the name Diddy was a brand, a synonym for success that smelled of champagne and ambition. He wasn't just a man, he was a monument to the hustle. But the hallway footage acted as a demolition charge at its base. The digital town square became a courtroom. Every past interview, every lyric, every swaggering public appearance was recontextualized. Social media became a vast, collaborative forensic unit, exhuming old ghosts and connecting forgotten dots. The narrative was no longer his to control. It belonged to the algorithm, which relentlessly served up evidence for the prosecution. Admiration curdled into disgust. The envy he once cultivated became a bitter schadenfreude. This was the construction of a digital coffin, built by millions of clicks and shares. The verdict was in. And it was absolute. The verdict was in. And it was absolute. But the architecture of this downfall wasn't built in a courtroom. It was built in a bank vault. For years, the immense gravity of his wealth distorted reality itself, creating a private universe where consequence was a foreign language. This wasn't just success, it was sovereign power. The kind that buys silence, edits memory, and paves over inconvenient truths with stacks of currency. His empire smelled of fresh ink on contracts and old fear. Each new success added another layer of concrete to the bunker walls, insulating the man inside from the world outside. He wasn't just above the law. He had his own, a system where loyalty was a commodity and dissent was a debt to be collected. The tragedy is not that the fortress fell. The tragedy is how long it stood, casting a shadow so dark that nothing could grow. Nothing could grow. And so the ghost began to talk. This is the posthumous audit, conducted not by accountants, but by the people who lived inside the machine. The former assistants, the bodyguards, the producers, the ones who saw the mask come off when the studio lights went dark. Their testimonies form a chilling chorus, a pattern woven from fear and ambition. They speak of a court, not a company. A closed loop where the king's mood was the weather forecast and his approval was the only currency that mattered. One called it a job that cost you your memory. Another described the suffocating pressure to become invisible, to see nothing, to say less. These weren't employees. They were fixtures in a curated reality. Their silence was part of the architecture of the empire. And when one voice broke through, it didn't just create a crack. It shattered the entire facade, revealing the hollow space, pause, where a soul used to be. This hollow space was an ecosystem. It had its own laws of gravity. To orbit pause combs was to accept the terms of this vacuum. This was the omerta of the Hamptons, a code of silence written on the back of a check. Its rules were simple. You see what you are paid to see. You forget what is inconvenient. Loyalty wasn't a feeling. It was a line item on a budget, an NDA with teeth of steel. Breaking rank was not a career misstep. It was a form of suicide. The machine that built you would be repurposed for your dismantling. Your name erased from guest lists. Your calls unanswered. A slow, methodical descent into professional irrelevance. This was the true anatomy of his power. Not the music, not the brands. It was the architecture of silence he built around himself, brick by painstaking brick. Each brick was a person, bound by fear or by gold, but mostly by the chilling knowledge that exile was a fate far worse than complicity. The verdict for traitors was not delivered in a courtroom. It was delivered in the crushing silence of a phone that pause never rings again. But the walls of that silent kingdom had a new unforeseen enemy, the digital mob. The carefully curated silence was shattered by a million anonymous keystrokes. Social media became the arena, a place where accusations didn't need to pass through the filter of network television or newspaper editors. They just needed to be potent. They spread not like news, but like a contagion. A hashtag became a weapon. A 30-second video clip became the closing argument. His entire legacy, decades of calculated image-making, was fed into the meat grinder of public opinion. Every carefully posed photograph was remixed into a meme. Every power move recontextualized as a confession. The defense was futile. For every official press release, there were 1,000 comments, 1,000,000 shares, building a digital coffin around his public persona. This was a new kind of verdict, one passed down not by a jury of 12, but by a mob of millions. And there is no appeal from that judgment. There is no parole. There is only the endless echoing scroll, pause of your own downfall. But a downfall of this magnitude is never a solo performance. It is a contagion. The verdict was not just a sentence for one man. It was a legacy bequeathed to his children, a birthright of shame. Their last name, once a key forged in gold, became a brand of infamy. Every headline about the father was a stone thrown at the sons and daughters. They were born into an empire. Pause. Now they are its primary creditors, owed a childhood that was cashed out for public relations. The tears shed in that courtroom were not just for a man's lost freedom. They were for a future that had been foreclosed upon. The sins of the father are not a metaphor. They are a trust fund filled with broken glass, A gilded cage whose bars are forged from public opinion. This is the cruelest collateral, the inheritance of a ghost. This was the final stage of the autopsy. The anatomy of a fall is also the anatomy of an image. For 30 years, the brand Diddy was a masterclass in myth-making. He wasn't just selling music, he was selling a lifestyle. A vision of black capitalism so potent it felt like a political statement. The Ciroc parties, the white suits, the unshakable confidence. It was all a carefully constructed reality. Pause. Now every piece of that construction is viewed as an exhibit. The parties look like crime scenes. The bravado reads like a confession. The public performs a posthumous audit on his entire cultural output, and the balance sheet is soaked in red. He was the icon of the hustle, the man who made it. Now he is a case study. A cautionary tale about the rot that can fester behind the facade of success. His name is no longer a synonym for ambition. It's a permanent stain on the very dream he claimed to embody. And so, the machine of federal justice began its slow, indifferent grind. This was no longer about culture or influence. It was about statutes and sentencing guidelines. The acquittal on the RICO charge was not a reprieve. It was a surgical decision by the jury. They spared the brand, but condemned the man. The government's case was a mountain of digital evidence, wiretaps, and sworn testimony, a fortress of accusation. Pause. But the trial itself was merely the public performance. The real war was waged in sealed motions and redacted exhibits, a shadow conflict fought by lawyers billing $1,000 an hour. The 2 counts for which he was convicted, transporting for the purpose of prostitution, were not the heart of the beast. They were the accessible, provable limbs. The state took what it could, a calculated amputation designed to neutralize, not annihilate. It was enough. The verdict was a judgment not on his entire life, but on the specific, provable moments where the mask slipped. And in the cold calculus of the law, a few moments are all it takes to bring an empire to its knees. The sentence was 50 months. A number, a sterile unit of time. For a man who measured his life in album cycles and fashion seasons, it was an incomprehensible void. This is the anatomy of the digital tomb. His name, once a global asset, now belongs to the Bureau of Prisons. Inmate number 800 and 85-054. The ultimate rebranding. The reports of him teaching business courses to fellow inmates are not a story of redemption. They are the last desperate twitch of a mogul's muscle memory. The king of branding, still trying to sell the dream from inside a concrete box. It is the saddest kind of hustle. The stark contrast is the true sentence. From private jets to a 6-by-9-foot cell. From Ciroc to lukewarm water in a plastic cup. This isn't a crucible for introspection. It's a sensory deprivation tank for the ego. Pause. The silence must be deafening. After a lifetime of applause, entourages, and ringing phones, there is only the hum of fluorescent lights and the clang of steel doors. The real question is not whether he will survive. The question is, what will be left of Pause Sean Combs when the ghost of Diddy is finally exorcised by loneliness and routine? That exorcism is not a personal affair. It is a demolition. The fall of Pause. Sean Combs is the raising of an entire wing in the Museum of Popular Culture. The wing dedicated to the 90s hip-hop mogul. He was the architect of that blueprint. The formula of taking street-level hunger, dressing it in Italian silk, and selling the resulting fantasy back to the world. It was a brilliant, intoxicating business model. But the ledger was always cooked. The shine of the platinum plaques was meant to blind you to the darkness required to acquire them. His fall exposes the structural rot of the entire industry that crowned him. An industry that feasted on his bravado and looked the other way. They weren't just at his parties. They were accomplices. The music was never just music. It was the soundtrack to an architecture of impunity. Pause now. The building is condemned, and everyone who ever danced inside is checking the foundations of their own success. So what is the final inventory of this shipwrecked legacy? It is a bitter testament, split down the middle. On one side, the innovator who dragged urban culture into the boardroom and onto the yacht. The man who made the brand more valuable than the beat. On the other, a case study in rot. A monument to the idea that power doesn't just corrupt, it consumes. The public fascination is no longer about the glamour. It is a public autopsy. We are not studying his business acumen. We are dissecting his pathology. The great reveal, the final plot twist, is that there was no dark side. It was all one side. The darkness was the fuel. The engine of the empire ran on fear and appetite. His lasting contribution to the culture is now a warning label. The name Sean Combs is no longer a brand. It is a verdict. And his most enduring creation was not a record label or a fashion line. It was the illusion that a man could build a throne so high that the law could never reach it. An expensive miscalculation.